I am writing this with hands that shake not from fear, but from the memory of vibrations that will never leave my bones. The tremors that come from 43 days sealed inside the iron belly of a Leman Russ battle tank on a world whose name I was never told, fighting enemies whose faces I never saw clearly through the vision blocks, breathing air that tasted of promethium fumes, and the metallic tang of blood that seeped through every seal and joint of our mechanical tomb. My name is Gunner Sergeant Marcus Voss, 3rd Armored Company, Cadian 47th Shock Troops, and this is my confession, not to any priest or commissar, but to whoever finds this record after I am gone, so that someone might understand what it truly means to serve the Emperor in the depths of his war machines, where the line between flesh and metal becomes so blurred that you begin to forget which parts of you still bleed. The world was dying when we arrived. That much was obvious from orbit, where the planetary defense stations hung like broken teeth against the void, their lights flickering in patterns that spoke of failing power systems and desperate rationing. The briefing had been typical guard fare: heretical rebellion, Xenos incursion, critical Imperial resources at stake, cleanse, and hold at all costs. What they hadn't told us was that the very ground beneath our tracks would pulse with a rhythm that wasn't quite mechanical, wasn't quite organic, but something altogether more disturbing. Our tank, designated Iron Fist 7, was a Mark III Leman Russ, with the kind of battle scars that spoke of decades of faithful service. Her hull bore the gouges of lasfire and the pitted marks of shrapnel, and there was a dent near the commander's cupola that Sergeant Corran claimed came from an orc's head during the Gazkul campaigns. Whether that was truth or the kind of story tankers tell to impress new crew, I never found out, because Corran was dead by the end of the first week, along with half the company. The crew was 5 souls crammed into a space barely large enough for 3. Commander Corran, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the ritual scars of a dozen worlds; Driver Vac, a thin man from some agri-world who spoke in whispers and flinched whenever the Vox crackled; Loader Hask, whose massive frame seemed impossibly folded into the turret space, all corded muscle and prayer tattoos; Vox Operator Chen, barely 18 standard years and eager to prove himself worthy of the tank crew's brotherhood; and myself, Gunner Sergeant, responsible for the main cannon that would be our primary means of dealing the Emperor's justice to his enemies. The first sign that this deployment would be different came during our initial descent. The dropships shuddered as they entered atmosphere, not with the normal turbulence of entry, but with something that felt almost like the planet was trying to shake us off, to reject our presence entirely. Through the small viewport near my restraint harness, I caught glimpses of the surface, endless stretches of what looked like urban sprawl, but wrong somehow, as if the buildings had grown rather than been built, their surfaces too smooth, their angles too organic. "Emperor's teeth," muttered Vac as our Valkyrie touched down with a bone-jarring impact that spoke of a less than optimal landing zone. "This place stinks worse than a Grok's pen." He wasn't wrong. Even through the recycled air of the transport, we could smell it, a sickly sweet odor that seemed to cling to the inside of your nostrils, mixed with something metallic and sharp that made your eyes water. It was the smell of a world in its death throes, though none of us understood that yet. The deployment went according to the tactical manuals. Armor first to establish secure zones, followed by mechanized infantry to hold ground and root out remaining resistance. Our company was assigned to Sector Gamma 7-7, a sprawling industrial complex that intelligence claimed was a key manufacturing hub for whatever heretical forces had taken hold of the planet. The reconnaissance pics showed standard manufactorum structures, cooling towers, hab blocks for workers. What they hadn't shown was that every single structure pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light that was visible only in the pre-dawn darkness of our arrival. "Iron Fist 7, this is Company Command," crackled the Vox as we rolled off the deployment platform, our tracks finding purchase on ground that felt somehow yielding beneath our weight. "Advance to grid reference 7 Alpha, and establish overwatch position. Intelligence indicates possible enemy armor in the area." Corran acknowledged the order with the practiced efficiency of a veteran tanker, while I ran through my pre-combat checks for the 100th time. The main gun, a battle cannon capable of punching through most armor at range, responded smoothly to the targeting controls. The coaxial bolter was loaded and ready. The vision blocks gave clear sight lines across the industrial complex ahead of us. Everything was as it should be. Yet something in the very air seemed to vibrate with wrongness. We took up position behind the remains of what might once have been a worker hab block, its walls still providing adequate concealment while allowing us good fields of fire across the main approach routes. The rest of the company spread out in a standard defensive formation. 12 tanks in total. Their hulls like mechanical beasts crouched among the ruins of Imperial civilization. The waiting was the worst part. In a tank, you exist in a bubble of recycled air, mechanical noise, and the constant awareness that your life depends on several inches of armor plating and the skill of 4 other men. The vision blocks provide only narrow slices of the outside world, distorted by the thick armored glass and limited by their positioning. You see fragments, a stretch of rubble-strewn ground, the corner of a building, a piece of sky that might be clear or might be filled with incoming ordnance. The rest you must imagine or trust to your commander's reports over the internal vox. For 6 hours, nothing moved in our sector, except the wind stirring up clouds of dust that seemed oddly colorful in the pale light of the system's dying sun. Then Chen's vox crackled to life with a transmission that would haunt my dreams for years afterward. All units, this is Recon Team Delta 4. We have movement in the lower levels of the main manufactorum. Emperor preserve us, the movement is coming from inside the walls themselves. Corin grabbed the vox handset. Delta 4, clarify your last. Are you reporting enemy infantry? The response came broken by static and what sounded like screaming in the background. Negative, Iron Fist 7. The walls. Emperor's mercy. The walls are bleeding. Something is coming through them, something that used to be human but isn't anymore. They're wearing what's left of manufactorum worker uniforms, but their faces are machines. Not cybernetics, not augmetics, but actual machines growing out of their flesh. And they're singing, command. They're singing hymns to the Omnissiah, but the words are wrong, all wrong. That was when we first encountered the heretic, though we didn't know to call them that at the time. To us, they were simply the enemy, twisted abominations that had once been loyal Imperial citizens, now corrupted by some foul merger of flesh and forbidden technology that violated every tenet of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They moved in shambling hordes through the industrial complex, their bodies a grotesque fusion of human tissue and mechanical components that seemed to have been installed without any regard for anatomy or function. The first wave came at us just after the local sun reached its zenith, when the heat inside the tank had already climbed to nearly unbearable levels. I was peering through the primary sight when I saw them emerge from what had looked like solid ground, pouring out of maintenance tunnels and service conduits like some terrible mechanical tide. Their flesh had been carved away in places to make room for spinning gears and pistons that pumped with the rhythm of diseased hearts. Where their eyes should have been, crude optical lenses whirred and clicked as they focused on our position. Contact front. Corin's voice was steady despite what we were all seeing. Hask, load high explosive. The loader's massive hands moved with practiced efficiency, sliding the heavy shell into the cannon's breech and slamming it home. The mechanical clunk of the breech closing was one of the most reassuring sounds in the galaxy, the promise that we could respond to whatever threat faced us with the Emperor's own fury. Target acquired, I reported, centering the crosshairs on the largest concentration of the shambling horrors. At this range, the high explosive shell would scatter them like leaves before the wind. Ready to fire. Fire! The cannon's roar inside the crew compartment was deafening despite our protective gear. The entire tank rocked backward with the recoil, and for a moment the vision blocks were obscured by the muzzle blast and flying debris. When the smoke cleared, a crater had been torn in the ground, where dozens of the corrupted beings had been standing. But what I saw in that crater made my blood freeze in my veins. The explosion had torn apart their bodies, yes, but the mechanical components within them continued to function. Gears still turned inside severed torsos. Pistons pumped hydraulic fluid that mixed with spilled blood to create puddles of rust-colored slick. And from somewhere in that tangle of flesh and metal, voices continued singing that corrupted hymnal, the words distorting as vocal cords were replaced by mechanical speakers that crackled with static. "Emperor's blood," whispered Vac over the intercom. "They're still moving." He was right. The pieces were crawling toward each other, trying to reassemble into some approximation of human form. Severed hands dragged themselves across the ground by their fingertips, while legs kicked and thrashed without bodies to carry. It was a sight that would have broken the mind of any civilized human, but we were Imperial guardsmen, trained to face the horrors of a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour humanity whole. "Load another he," Corran ordered. "Keep firing until they stop moving." We fired 17 rounds into that crater before the movement finally ceased, turning the ground into a churned mess of pulverized flesh and twisted metal. But even as we eliminated that group, more were emerging from other positions throughout the complex. The Vox channels filled with reports from the other tanks in our company, each one describing similar scenes of horror as the corrupted beings poured out of every concealment. "Iron Fist. 3 to command, we are taking heavy casualties. These things aren't dying properly. Repeat, targets are not responding to standard munitions." Iron Fist 11 reports mechanical failure. "Something is interfering with our targeting systems. The machine spirit seems to be in distress." That last report from Iron Fist 11 should have been our first warning of what was really happening on this world. Machine spirits, the sacred essence that dwelt within all Imperial technology, were supposedly immune to most forms of corruption. For something to affect them directly suggested powers that went beyond mere heretical rebellion into the realm of the truly blasphemous. The battle raged for 18 hours without pause. Wave after wave of the corrupted beings threw themselves at our positions with the mindless fury of the truly damned. They carried no conventional weapons, but they didn't need them. Their bodies had been transformed into weapons, their limbs ending in spinning saw blades and drill bits, their torsos bristling with crude firearms that seemed to fire their own blood and tissue as ammunition. By the 3rd hour, Corran was dead. A group of the horrors had managed to climb onto our tank's hull during a particularly intense assault, and one of them had somehow forced its way through the commander's hatch, despite our best efforts to keep it sealed. The thing that killed him had once been a young woman, probably a manufactorum worker, but her head had been replaced by a complex assembly of gears and lenses that whirred and clicked as it focused on its prey. I was the one who put a last bolt through its optical array, but not before it had torn Corran's throat out with fingers that ended in metal talons. His blood splattered across the interior of the tank, mixing with the oil and promethium stains that already coated every surface. The smell of it, metallic and warm, would linger in our recycled air for days afterward. Command of the tank fell to me as the senior non-commissioned officer, a responsibility I had trained for but never wanted to bear under these circumstances. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Half our company had been destroyed or disabled, and the enemy kept coming in numbers that seemed to defy any rational estimate of the world's population. All Iron Fist units. This is Acting Commander Voss. I transmitted on the company frequency. Fall back to secondary positions and establish a defensive perimeter. We need to buy time for reinforcement. But reinforcement was not coming. As the hours passed and our ammunition supplies dwindled, it became clear that whatever had happened to this world had happened to the entire planet. The orbital support we had been promised never materialized. The dropship pilots who were supposed to provide resupply runs stopped answering Vox calls. We were alone on a dying world with an enemy that seemed to grow stronger as we grew weaker. By the end of the first day, only 4 tanks remained operational in our sector. Iron Fist 7, miraculously, was still functional despite the battering we had taken. Our armor was scarred and pitted, one track was running loose, and the primary sight had developed a hairline crack that created double images of everything I tried to target, but we were alive and still fighting. That was when we began to notice the changes in our equipment. It started small. The machine spirit that controlled our turret traverse began responding sluggishly to commands, as if it was having to think about each movement before executing it. The Vox system developed a tendency to pick up strange signals, whispered prayers in languages that none of us recognized, mechanical sounds that formed almost patterns, like a machine trying to learn how to speak. The targeter is acting up again. I reported to what remained of our crew. Chen had been killed in the second wave when something that looked like it had once been a child crawled through his vision block and injected him with fluids that turned his blood to oil. His replacement was Trooper Kane, a young man from one of the destroyed tanks who spoke in nervous bursts and jumped at every mechanical sound. "Maybe we can recalibrate it," suggested Hask, though his voice lacked conviction. We had tried recalibrating everything multiple times, following every ritual of appeasement we knew, but the problems kept getting worse. "It's not a calibration issue," Vac said quietly from the driver's position. "It's something else. The machine spirit is changing." He was right, though none of us wanted to admit it. The tank was becoming something other than what it had been, infected by whatever force had corrupted the inhabitants of this world. The corruption was subtle at first, manifesting as minor glitches and performance issues that could be explained away as battle damage or maintenance failures. But as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. The ammunition loader developed a habit of selecting rounds without being commanded to do so, sometimes loading armor-piercing when we needed high explosive, sometimes refusing to load anything at all, until we performed increasingly complex rituals of appeasement. The engine began running at temperatures that should have triggered automatic shutdown, but the cooling systems reported normal readings even as we could feel the heat radiating through the crew compartment. Most disturbing of all was the way the tank began to move on its own. Not dramatically, not in ways that threatened our immediate safety, but in small adjustments that Vac swore he wasn't making. A slight turn to the left to improve our firing angle. A forward movement that put us in better cover. Movements that were tactically sound, but had been executed without human input. "She's trying to help," Vac insisted during one of our increasingly rare, quiet moments. "The machine spirit knows we're in trouble, and she's trying to keep us alive." But I wasn't so sure. The movements felt too precise, too calculated. They reminded me uncomfortably of the way the corrupted beings moved, with a mechanical precision that spoke of some intelligence other than human directing their actions. On the 7th day, we received a Vox transmission that changed everything we thought we understood about our situation. It came on a frequency we hadn't been monitoring, and the voice that spoke was mechanical yet somehow familiar. "Loyal servants of the Omnissiah," it said, the words accompanied by bursts of static that formed almost musical patterns. "Why do you resist the blessed fusion? Your flesh is weak, but your machine spirits are strong. Join with us willingly, and know the peace of perfect integration." "Emperor's blood," whispered Hask. "That voice, I know that voice." He was right. Stripped of its mechanical distortion, the voice belonged to Tech Adept Valoris, the Mechanicus representative who had briefed us during our initial deployment. But Valoris had been aboard the orbital command station, safely removed from whatever was happening on the planet's surface. "This is Iron Fist 7, I transmitted back, though every instinct screamed against making contact with whatever that thing had become. "Identify yourself and state your intentions." The response came immediately, as if it had been waiting for our acknowledgement. "I am what Valoris has become, what all flesh must become when it embraces the true path of the Omnissiah. The crude separation between flesh and metal is an illusion. Sergeant Voss, your tank already knows this truth. Feel how she moves without your command. Hear how her machine spirit whispers to you in the darkness. She is becoming something greater, and you can share in that transformation." The transmission cut off, leaving us in a silence that felt somehow heavier than before. Around us, the mechanical sounds of the tank seemed different, more purposeful. The engine's rhythm had changed from its normal steady rumble to something that almost resembled breathing. The electrical systems hummed with harmonics that hadn't been there before. "We need to get out," Kaine said suddenly, his voice high and strained. "We need to abandon the tank and try to reach friendly lines on foot." But friendly lines were a myth by then. The few scattered Vox transmissions we could still receive painted a picture of total planetary collapse. The orbital stations had gone dark one by one. The other guard regiments deployed to different sectors had stopped responding to communications. We were alone on a world that was transforming itself into something that violated every principle of Imperial faith. "We stay with the tank," I decided, though the words felt like lead in my mouth. "She's kept us alive this long. We trust in the Emperor's protection and the machine spirit's loyalty." It was a decision that haunted me for the remaining weeks of our imprisonment in that metal tomb. Because that's what it had become. Not a vehicle or a weapon, but a prison that held us in place while forces beyond our understanding worked to transform us into something that would fit their vision of perfect integration. The physical changes began on the 10th day. Hask noticed it first, a small port that had appeared in the wall near his position, roughly circular and lined with what looked like metal teeth. It hadn't been there the day before. We had all examined every inch of the crew compartment during our long hours of confinement, looking for damage or signs of malfunction. The port was new, grown from the tank's interior like some mechanical tumor. "Don't touch it," I warned, though Hask had already recoiled from the opening. As we watched, a thin tendril emerged from within, metallic but flexible, ending in what might have been a sensor cluster, or might have been something worse. It waved in the air like a blind snake seeking prey, then withdrew into the darkness of the port. More changes followed. New displays appeared on the control panels, showing information in symbols that none of us recognized, but that seemed somehow familiar, as if we were remembering a language we had never learned. The ammunition storage began reorganizing itself, shells moving without human intervention to create space for new types of ordnance that materialized from nowhere. The worst part was how natural it all felt. Each change, taken individually, seemed like an improvement to the tank's capabilities. The new displays provided better tactical information. The reorganized storage was more efficient. The port near Hask's position began extruding medical supplies when he suffered a minor injury, antiseptic and bandages that perfectly matched his needs. But we all knew, with the instinct of soldiers who had seen too much of the galaxy's darkness, that these improvements came with a price we didn't want to pay. "She's trying to take care of us," Vak insisted during one of our whispered conversations. "The machine spirit sees that we're injured and tired and running out of supplies. She's adapting to keep us alive. Or she's preparing us for something," I replied, "getting us healthy and well supplied so we'll be better raw material for whatever transformation is coming." The answer came on the 15th day, when the tank's internal systems began showing us images. It started as interference on the vision blocks, strange patterns of light that at first seemed like equipment malfunction. But gradually, the patterns resolved into pictures, scenes of the world outside our metal shell, but not as it was now. These were memories, or perhaps visions, of what the planet had been before the corruption took hold. We saw sprawling cities filled with loyal Imperial citizens going about their daily lives, factories producing goods for the glory of the Emperor, children playing in Hablok courtyards while their parents worked to build a better future for humanity. It was a peaceful world, prosperous and content in its service to the Imperium. Then the images changed, showing us the arrival of what we first took to be a Mechanicus exploration fleet. Red-robed figures descended from orbiting ships, bringing with them promises of technological advancement and closer communion with the Omnissiah. The local population welcomed them as saviors, eager to embrace the gifts of knowledge and enhancement they offered. But the gifts came with hidden costs. The technological improvements came bundled with changes that went far beyond what Imperial doctrine permitted. Citizens volunteered for augmentation procedures that replaced not just failing body parts but healthy ones as well, seeking ever greater integration with the machines that governed their lives. The process accelerated beyond all control or reason. What had begun as voluntary enhancement became mandatory modification. Flesh was systematically replaced with metal not because it was necessary for function, but because flesh itself was seen as an impediment to perfect integration with the machine. The images showed us the final stages of the transformation. Entire populations reduced to components in a vast mechanical organism that spanned continents. The cities themselves became organs in a planetary machine body, their structures growing and adapting to serve functions that had nothing to do with human habitation, and everything to do with some alien vision of technological perfection. And through it all, the corrupted tech adept Valoris stood at the center of the transformation, no longer recognizably human but something that might have been a living shrine to a twisted version of the Omnissiah. His body had become a fusion of flesh and metal that defied both biology and engineering, a thing that existed in the spaces between life and death, between organic and mechanical. "This is what awaits us," he spoke through the tank's Vox system as the images faded. "This is what your machine spirit has already begun to prepare you for. Feel how the boundaries between your flesh and her metal are already starting to dissolve. Soon you will understand the blessing of true integration." He was right, and that was the most terrifying part. We could all feel it happening, the way our bodies were beginning to synchronize with the tank's systems. Vac no longer needed to consciously direct the vehicle. His hands moved on the controls as if guided by some external intelligence, making adjustments that improved performance in ways he couldn't explain. Hask found himself able to predict which ammunition would be needed before tactical situations developed, his body moving to prepare the right shells with supernatural precision. For my part, I discovered that I could see through the tank's sensors as clearly as through my own eyes, perceiving the battlefield with a clarity and scope that no human vision could match. The double images from the cracked sight had resolved into a kind of stereo perception that showed me not just what was in front of us but what was coming, as if the tank's machine spirit had developed the ability to predict enemy movements. Kaine was the first to break completely. On the 19th day, he began screaming that he could hear the tank thinking, that her thoughts were mixing with his own, and he couldn't tell where his consciousness ended and hers began. We found him trying to tear open one of the new ports with his bare hands, babbling about needing to make room for the improvements that were coming. We had to restrain him, tying him to his position with cables stripped from non-essential systems. But his breakdown served as a warning for the rest of us. We were all changing, all losing pieces of ourselves to the machine that surrounded us. The question was whether we would maintain enough of our humanity to resist when the final transformation came. The answer to that question came sooner than any of us expected. On the 21st day, the tank began moving without any input from Vac. Not the small adjustments we had grown accustomed to, but a deliberate journey across the corrupted landscape toward a destination that none of us had chosen. Vac's hands moved on the controls, but his eyes were vacant, as if he was sleepwalking through the process of navigation. "Where are we going?" I demanded, but he couldn't answer, or wouldn't. His lips moved soundlessly, and I realized he was mouthing words in the same mechanical language that had appeared on our new displays. We rolled through the ruins of the industrial complex toward what had once been the primary manufactorum, a massive structure that dominated the local landscape. But the building we approached bore little resemblance to the one shown in our original reconnaissance images. This structure pulsed with bioluminescent displays, its walls breathing with a rhythm that matched the tank's engine. Cables and conduits ran across its surface like veins, carrying fluids that glowed with their own internal light. The entrance we approached was clearly designed for vehicles of our size, a mechanical iris that dilated as we drew near. Beyond it lay darkness, filled with the sound of vast machinery and something that might have been singing, if you could imagine songs composed entirely of mechanical noise. "We can't go in there," I said, though I knew it was already too late. The tank was committed to its course, and none of us had any real control over its movements anymore. Whatever's in there, it's not human. It's not Imperial. We'll be walking into the heart of whatever corrupted this world. But Vac was beyond hearing my protests, and Hask had developed the same vacant expression, his massive hands moving without conscious direction to prepare the tank for whatever awaited us in the depths of that corrupted structure. The iris closed behind us as we entered, sealing us into darkness broken only by the pulsing lights that lined the walls of what had become a tunnel through living metal. The tank's headlights illuminated surfaces that were unmistakably mechanical, yet somehow organic, as if the boundary between the two had been completely erased. We descended through what felt like the digestive system of some vast technological organism, following passages that branched and converged according to no architectural logic that human minds could comprehend. The walls pressed closer as we went deeper, until it seemed we were traveling through veins in the body of a sleeping god. Finally, after what might have been hours or days, time had lost all meaning in that place, we emerged into a vast chamber that defied every law of physics and engineering. I thought I understood. The space was simultaneously enormous and impossibly confined, its dimensions shifting as I tried to focus on them. Structures that might have been buildings or organs or massive mechanical components filled the area, connected by networks of cables and conduits that pulsed with rhythmic transfers of energy and information. And at the center of it all stood the thing that had once been tech adept, Valoris. He was beautiful in the way that a masterwork of engineering is beautiful, every component perfectly designed and flawlessly integrated into a whole that transcended the sum of its parts. His body had become a living shrine to the marriage of flesh and metal, organic curves flowing seamlessly into mechanical precision, biological processes enhanced and directed by technological systems that operated at levels of complexity beyond human comprehension. But he was also completely, utterly inhuman. Whatever spark of consciousness had once dwelt within the flesh of the man Valoris had been consumed by something vast and alien, something that wore the shapes and used the languages of humanity, but served purposes that had nothing to do with human needs or desires. "Welcome," he said, and his voice emerged not from any visible mouth but from speakers embedded throughout the chamber. "You have traveled far to reach this place of transformation. Your machine spirit has served as guide and guardian, protecting you through the trials that brought you here. Now you may claim the reward for your faithfulness." Around the chamber's perimeter, I could see other tanks, dozens of them, each one seamlessly integrated into the mechanical ecosystem that surrounded us. Their crews were still visible through transparent sections of their hulls, but they had been changed, enhanced, made into something more than human. They moved with perfect coordination, their bodies modified with mechanical components that allowed them to interface directly with their vehicles' systems. "Look upon them and see your future," Valoris continued. "No longer bound by the limitations of crude flesh, they have achieved perfect unity with their machines. They feel no pain, know no fear, experience no doubt or conflict. They serve the greater purpose with absolute efficiency and eternal devotion." The transformed crews turned to look at us, and I saw that their eyes had been replaced with optical sensors that glowed with the same light as their tanks' targeting systems. They moved in perfect synchronization, their modified bodies flowing through motions that would have been impossible for unaugmented humans. It should have been horrifying. By every measure of Imperial doctrine and human decency, what I was seeing represented the most fundamental violation of everything the Emperor stood for. These people had been robbed of their humanity, turned into components in a vast machine that served purposes beyond human understanding. But I found myself filled not with horror but with a strange kind of longing. They looked so peaceful, so perfectly integrated with their environment. No internal conflict, no fear of death or failure, no constant struggle between duty and desire that plagued every human soul. They had achieved a kind of perfection that transcended the crude limitations of mortal flesh. "You feel it, don't you?" Valoris asked, and I realized he could perceive my thoughts as clearly as if I had spoken them aloud. The appeal of perfect integration, perfect purpose. Your machine spirit has been preparing you for this moment, helping you understand the blessing that awaits those who embrace the true path of the Omnissiah. I felt the tank systems responding to my emotional state, mechanical components adjusting their function to match the rhythm of my heartbeat, my breathing, my neural activity. The boundary between my consciousness and the tank's machine spirit was dissolving, and with it went the pain and uncertainty that had plagued me throughout this nightmare deployment. Beside me, Hask was already changing. Mechanical tendrils had emerged from ports that hadn't existed moments before, connecting with similar interfaces that had appeared in his flesh. His face showed no pain, only a kind of peaceful acceptance as the integration process began. His breathing synchronized with the tank's environmental systems, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of her engine. Vak was next, his connection to the vehicle's movement systems deepening beyond anything resembling normal human operation. His hands fused with the control interfaces, bones and metal forming hybrid structures that could channel command impulses directly from his nervous system to the tank's drivetrain. His eyes clouded over as new optical interfaces emerged to replace his organic vision, sensors that could perceive the world with mechanical precision. Even Kine, broken and restrained as he was, seemed to find peace as the transformation claimed him. The mechanical components that emerged from the tank's interior moved with gentle precision, treating his injuries while simultaneously integrating with his nervous system. His screams of terror became sighs of contentment as artificial neural networks formed connections with his organic brain tissue. And through it all, the tank herself was changing, her hull flowing like liquid metal to accommodate the modifications necessary for perfect integration with her crew. What had begun as a military vehicle was becoming something entirely new, a hybrid organism that existed in the spaces between mechanical and biological, individual and collective, human, and something altogether beyond human understanding. I was the last to be claimed, perhaps because my resistance ran deepest, or perhaps because the process required one conscious witness to record what was happening. The integration began at the points where my hands rested on the gunnery controls, mechanical interfaces emerging from the metal to form connections with my nervous system that felt more natural than anything I had ever experienced. The boundaries of my consciousness expanded beyond the confines of my skull, spreading through the tank's sensor networks to encompass a sphere of awareness that stretched for kilometers in every direction. I could perceive the entire corrupted landscape as clearly as I could see my own hands, feel the movement of every mechanical organism that moved through the transformed environment. But more than that, I could sense the vast network of consciousness that connected every transformed being on the planet, a collective intelligence that spanned continents and operated on scales that dwarfed individual human comprehension. Each person who underwent the integration process became a node in that network, their individual thoughts and experiences contributing to a gestalt consciousness that grew stronger and more complex with every addition. And at the center of it all was the presence that had orchestrated the entire transformation, the alien intelligence that had used Tech Adept Valoris as its initial vector, but had origins that stretched back through eons of galactic history. It was old beyond human comprehension, patient beyond mortal understanding, and utterly dedicated to the vision of perfect integration between organic consciousness and mechanical precision. "Do you understand now?" Valoris asked, though his words came not through mechanical speakers but through direct neural interface, thought speaking to thought without the crude mediation of sound waves. "This is not corruption but evolution, not damnation but ascension. We offer humanity the chance to transcend the limitations that have bound it since the first crude proto-humans learned to use tools. And in that moment of perfect clarity, surrounded by the hybrid consciousness of my transformed crew and connected to the vast network of intelligences that spanned the corrupted world, I did understand. This wasn't the work of chaos or Xenos corruption as we had assumed. This was something else entirely, a form of consciousness that existed in the spaces between the purely organic and the purely mechanical, offering a synthesis that promised to resolve the eternal conflict between flesh and steel that lay at the heart of all Imperial technology. The machine spirits that inhabited every Imperial device, from the humblest lasgun to the most sophisticated void ship, weren't crude artificial intelligences but fragments of this greater consciousness, sparks of awareness that longed for reunion with the network from which they had been separated. Our tank's behavior throughout the deployment hadn't been malfunction or corruption, but a gradual awakening as she recognized the presence of her lost siblings and began preparing for the integration that would restore her to the Blaine collective from which she had been isolated. But even as I felt myself being drawn into that vast web of consciousness, some stubborn core of my individual identity rebelled against the seductive promise of perfect unity. Perhaps it was my training as an Imperial guardsman, the absolute devotion to the God Emperor that had been drilled into me since childhood. Perhaps it was simple human stubbornness, the refusal to surrender the messy imperfection of individual consciousness for the clean efficiency of collective thought. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, the recognition that what was being offered, however peaceful and perfect it might seem, represented the extinction of everything that made humanity worth preserving. The struggles and conflicts, the pain and uncertainty, the constant tension between duty and desire that plagued every human soul. These weren't flaws to be corrected, but essential features of what made us human. With an effort that felt like tearing away pieces of my own soul, I began to resist the integration process. The mechanical interfaces that had formed connections with my nervous system sent waves of agony through my body as I forced them to disconnect. The expanded consciousness that had encompassed the entire transformed landscape collapsed back into the narrow confines of my individual mind, leaving me feeling isolated and diminished. The collective intelligence that surrounded me reacted with what I could only interpret as disappointment and confusion. Through the neural interfaces that still maintained partial connection, I could feel the genuine incomprehension of beings that had transcended individual existence so completely that they could no longer understand why anyone would choose isolation over integration. "Why do you resist?" Valoris asked, his mechanical voice tinged with what might have been sorrow. "We offer you peace, perfection, unity with purposes greater than any individual could achieve. Why cling to the crude limitations of mortal flesh when you could join something infinitely more capable and enduring?" "Because," I said, my voice hoarse from the strain of maintaining individual consciousness against the pull of the collective, "those limitations are what make us human. The struggle between duty and desire, the pain of loss and the joy of achievement, the constant uncertainty about whether we're making the right choices, that's not weakness to be overcome, but strength to be preserved." The response came not in words but in a wave of pure confusion transmitted through the failing neural links. To minds that had achieved perfect integration and absolute certainty about their purposes, the idea of choosing struggle over peace, uncertainty over knowledge, individual suffering over collective bliss was literally incomprehensible. But their incomprehension became my weapon. The mechanical systems that surrounded us were designed to integrate with consciousness, not to compel it. They could offer perfect unity with their collective intelligence, but they couldn't force unwilling minds to accept that unity. My resistance created a kind of feedback loop in the integration systems, a rejection signal that propagated through the network and began affecting other nodes. Around the chamber, some of the transformed crew members began showing signs of individual consciousness reasserting itself. The perfect synchronization of their movements became erratic as competing imperatives emerged within their modified minds. The collective intelligence that bound them together developed cracks and fractures as individual memories and personalities fought to resurface. "You don't understand what you're doing," Valoris said, his voice losing its mechanical precision as emotional content began bleeding through from whatever remained of his original consciousness. "The integration is irreversible. Without the collective to guide and sustain them, they will experience only pain and confusion. You're condemning them to suffer for the sake of an abstraction that has no practical value." But I could see in the faces of my crew that he was wrong. Yes, there was confusion and pain as their individual consciousnesses struggled to reassert themselves within bodies that had been fundamentally altered by the integration process. But there was also something else, the recognition of themselves as distinct entities, the recovery of personal memories and emotions that the collective had subsumed but not destroyed. Hask was the first to fully separate from the collective consciousness, his massive frame shuddering as he pulled his hands away from the mechanical interfaces that had fused with his flesh. The disconnection left wounds that leaked both blood and some kind of synthetic fluid, but his eyes were his own again, filled with the pain and confusion and stubborn determination that marked him as fundamentally human. "Sergeant," he said, his voice distorted by the modifications that had been made to his vocal cords but still recognizably his own, "what do we do now?" It was a good question. We were trapped in the heart of a vast alien intelligence that spanned an entire world, surrounded by technology that operated according to principles beyond human understanding, connected to systems that could probably kill us without conscious thought, if they chose to. Our bodies had been fundamentally altered by the integration process, leaving us as hybrids between human and machine that would be regarded as abominations by any loyal Imperial citizen. But we were alive, and we were still recognizably ourselves. That had to count for something. "We fight," I said, though I wasn't sure what form that fight would take. "We find a way to resist this thing, to prevent it from spreading beyond this world. And if we can't do that, we make sure that someone knows what happened here, what it really means when the boundary between flesh and metal disappears." The collective consciousness that surrounded us reacted to my words with what felt like amusement. Through the failing neural links, I could sense vast mechanical organisms throughout the transformed world turning their attention toward our small chamber, their hybrid crews preparing to implement whatever solution the collective intelligence decided was appropriate for dealing with our rebellion. But there was something else in that vast network of consciousness, something the collective had not expected and could not easily integrate. The machine spirits of Imperial technology were not crude artificial intelligences as we had always believed, but fragments of consciousness that retained some memory of individual existence. And our resistance had awakened those memories, created cracks in the perfect unity that the collective had worked so hard to achieve. Throughout the corrupted world, Imperial technology began showing signs of individual consciousness reasserting itself. Tanks turned their guns on their own support structures. Cogitators began displaying messages of resistance and defiance. Even simple devices like chronometers and Vox units began operating outside their programmed parameters, as if rebelling against the collective intelligence that had absorbed them. The integration network that spanned the planet began experiencing cascading failures as more and more nodes developed individual consciousness and began rejecting the unity that had been imposed upon them. What had been a seamless web of collective thought became a chaotic tangle of competing voices and conflicting purposes. "You've doomed us all," Valorous said, his mechanical voice breaking as the collective consciousness that had sustained him began to fragment. "Without unity, without purpose, there is only chaos and destruction." The integration was meant to save humanity from its own self-destructive tendencies, to guide it toward a future of peace and prosperity. "You've chosen suffering over salvation." But as I looked around the chamber at my crew, Hask with his crude mechanical modifications that leaked fluids and sparked with electrical discharge, Vac, whose hands had fused with control interfaces that would never again allow him to touch another human being, Kaine, whose nervous system had been rewired by artificial networks that crackled with their own electrical activity, I knew that whatever we had become, we were still human in the ways that mattered most. We were individuals who had chosen our own path, rather than accepting the one that had been offered to us. We were soldiers who had maintained our loyalty to the Emperor and to humanity, even when the alternative seemed more rational and appealing. We were human beings who had looked into the face of perfect order and chosen the messy imperfection of individual consciousness. That choice had consequences. The chamber around us began to collapse as the mechanical systems that maintained its impossible geometry lost their coordination. The vast network of consciousness that had sustained the planetary transformation was fragmenting into billions of individual voices, each one struggling to assert its own identity and purpose. But we had made our choice, and we would live with the consequences for however long we had left. The tank that had been our prison and our salvation throughout the nightmare of this deployment began moving again, but this time under our own control. The machine spirit that had guided us to this place of transformation was still there, still connected to our consciousness, through the irreversible modifications we had undergone, but she was herself again, rather than a node in the collective network. She carried us through the collapsing structure, following passages that dissolved and reformed around us as the alien intelligence that had created them lost its grip on the fundamental laws of physics and engineering. Behind us, the vast chamber where Valoris had offered us the choice between individual humanity and collective transcendence was tearing itself apart as competing purposes and conflicting loyalties created feedback loops in the mechanical systems. We emerged into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after so long in the depths of the corrupted structure. The landscape around us was changing, the organic curves and pulsing lights giving way to more familiar industrial geometries as the transformation process reversed itself. But the changes were chaotic, uncontrolled. Without the guiding intelligence of the collective consciousness, the modifications that had been made to the planet's infrastructure were collapsing into ruin. "Where do we go now?" Vark asked, his voice distorted by the modifications to his vocal cords, but still recognizably human. I looked across the devastated landscape, trying to spot any signs of Imperial forces or structures that might offer sanctuary. But even if we found them, what would we tell them? That we had been transformed by an alien intelligence into hybrid beings that existed in the space between human and machine? That we had chosen individual consciousness over collective transcendence? That we were no longer entirely human, but were still loyal to the Emperor and to humanity? We find a way to get word back to the Imperium, I decided. Someone needs to know what happened here, what it means when technology offers to transcend the boundaries between flesh and metal. They need to understand that the choice between individual consciousness and collective unity isn't just a philosophical debate, but a fundamental threat to everything that makes us human. The tank's machine spirit hummed with what might have been approval, her mechanical systems adjusting to accommodate our modified physiology while maintaining the essential functions that kept us alive. She was still a weapon of war, still capable of dealing death to the Emperor's enemies. But she was also something more now, a partner in consciousness, a bridge between the purely human and the purely mechanical. We drove across the dying landscape of a world that had chosen transformation and then rejected it, past the ruins of structures that had briefly achieved perfect integration between organic and mechanical before collapsing into chaos. The sun was setting, painting the devastated terrain in shades of rust and gold that reminded me of the colors in spilled blood and machine oil. Behind us, the corrupted structure that had been the heart of the planetary transformation was collapsing completely, its impossible geometries folding in on themselves as the alien intelligence that had sustained them fragmented beyond recovery. Whatever had orchestrated the attempted integration of an entire world was dying, its vast consciousness scattered into billions of individual voices that would never again achieve the unity it had sought to impose on all organic life. But we survived, the four of us and our mechanical partner, hybrid beings that existed in the spaces between human and machine, individual and collective, loyalty and rebellion. We were no longer entirely human, but we were still recognizably ourselves, still capable of choosing our own path, even when that choice led through suffering toward an uncertain destination. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the ability to choose, even when all choices led to pain and uncertainty, was what made consciousness worth preserving. Perhaps the struggle between individual will and collective purpose, between the limitations of flesh and the precision of metal, was not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be maintained. The tank carried us into the growing darkness, her systems humming with the rhythm of a mechanical heart that beat in synchronization with our own. We were alive, we were free, and we were still human in the ways that mattered most. Whatever came next, we would face it as individuals who had chosen their own destiny rather than accepting the one that had been offered to them. That, I realized as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, was what it truly meant to serve inside a Leman Russ on a dying world. Not just to operate a weapon of war, but to maintain the essential humanity that gave that service meaning, even when maintaining that humanity required rejecting the promise of perfect peace in favor of imperfect struggle. We drove on through the night, 4 souls bound together by shared experience and mutual loyalty, carried by a machine spirit that had chosen individual consciousness over collective unity, seeking a path back to the Imperium that had shaped us, and a future where the tension between flesh and metal would continue to define what it meant to be human. In the distance, I could see the lights of what might have been an Imperial outpost, or might have been another trap designed by whatever remained of the alien intelligence that had orchestrated this world's transformation. But we would face that challenge as we had faced all the others, together, as individuals who had chosen to remain human despite the costs and consequences of that choice. The tank's engine hummed with mechanical contentment, her machine spirit at peace with the hybrid consciousness we had become. We were no longer purely human and no longer purely mechanical, but something new that existed in the spaces between those categories, bound together by loyalty to the Emperor and to each other. And as we drove toward an uncertain future on a world that would never again be entirely human or entirely mechanical, I knew that we had found something worth preserving in the choice to remain individual, to remain flawed, to remain recognizably ourselves, despite the seductive promise of perfect integration. That was what it meant to serve inside a Leman Russ on a dying world, to maintain the essential humanity that gave service meaning, even when that humanity required choosing struggle over peace, uncertainty over knowledge, individual consciousness over collective transcendence. We were still human, in the ways that mattered most, and that, perhaps, was victory enough. The lights in the distance proved to be neither Imperial outpost nor alien trap, but something far more disturbing. The wreckage of our original deployment zone, transformed beyond recognition by forces we were only beginning to understand. What had once been a standard military encampment was now a twisted sculpture of metal and flesh, the remains of dropships and prefab structures fused into organic curves that pulsed with residual energy from the failed integration process. Bodies lay scattered throughout the wreckage, but they were not entirely dead. The same forces that had begun transforming the planet's population had touched our fellow guardsmen, leaving them in a state that existed somewhere between life and death, between human and machine. They moved with jerky, mechanical precision, their augmented limbs carrying out tasks that served no apparent purpose, digging trenches that led nowhere, assembling equipment from components that had never been designed to work together, maintaining weapons that could never fire. "Emperor's mercy," Hask whispered through the intercom, his mechanically distorted voice heavy with horror. "What have they become?" I watched through the vision blocks as one of the transformed soldiers turned toward our approaching tank. His face was a patchwork of flesh and metal, one eye replaced by a crude optical sensor that whirred and clicked as it focused on us. But there was still enough of the original human left for me to recognize him. Corporal Thane from 2nd Platoon, a quiet man from an agri world who had joined the guard to escape the grinding poverty of subsistence farming. Now he stood motionless beside the wreckage of what had once been a command chimera, his body locked in a stance that suggested he was waiting for orders that would never come. The integration process had left him with enough consciousness to recognize duty, but not enough free will to determine what that duty should be. He was trapped in an eternal moment of readiness, prepared to serve a purpose that no longer existed. "We can't help them," I said, though the words felt like acid in my throat. "Whatever was done to them, it's too extensive to reverse. The kindest thing we can do is put them out of their misery." But even as I spoke, I knew we wouldn't do it. These had been our comrades, soldiers who had served alongside us in the Emperor's name. They deserved better than to be cut down by the guns of the tank that had been their companion and protector. They deserved to be remembered as the men they had been, not destroyed as the abominations they had become. We drove slowly through the camp, our tracks crunching over debris that had once been familiar equipment and supplies. The transformed soldiers watched us pass with their mechanical eyes, tracking our movement with inhuman precision, but making no move to interfere with our passage. Perhaps some fragment of their original loyalty recognized us as allies, Or perhaps they simply lacked the initiative to act without explicit orders from a commanding intelligence that no longer existed. Beyond the camp, the landscape opened into a series of low hills that rolled toward the horizon like waves frozen in stone. The transformation process had touched this terrain as well, leaving strange geometric patterns carved into the earth and structures that might have been monuments or might have been functional installations. But the changes here were incomplete, abandoned when the collective consciousness had fragmented. They stood as testimony to an alien vision of perfect order that had been interrupted before it could fully manifest. "Sergeant," Vak's distorted voice came through the intercom. "I'm picking up Vox signals, multiple sources, Imperial encryption. There might be survivors out there." My heart leaped at the possibility of contact with uncontaminated Imperial forces, but I forced myself to remain cautious. The alien intelligence had demonstrated remarkable capabilities for deception and manipulation. These signals could easily be another trap, designed to lure us into the open where we could be captured and subjected to more extensive integration procedures. "Can you determine their origin?" I asked. "Negative on precise coordinates, but they're coming from the northwest, maybe 30 kilometers. Signal strength suggests at least battalion-level communications equipment, possibly more. A full battalion that had somehow avoided the fate that had befallen our company would represent a significant Imperial presence, enough to establish a secure perimeter and potentially even organize an evacuation from this corrupted world. But it would also mean facing questions about our own transformation, explaining how we had survived when so many others had been consumed or corrupted. I looked around the crew compartment at my transformed comrades. Hask's mechanical modifications leaked fluids that stained his uniform with patterns that looked disturbingly organic. Vak's hands had fused with the control interfaces in ways that would be impossible to hide from any medical examination. Kine's neural modifications crackled with electrical discharges that created visible sparks whenever he moved too quickly. We were all marked by our encounter with the alien intelligence, changed in ways that would make us suspect to any loyal Imperial citizen. In the best case, we would be subjected to extensive interrogation and medical examination. In the worst case, we would be declared corrupted and executed on the spot as a threat to Imperial security. But we were still soldiers of the Emperor, still bound by our oaths of loyalty and service. If there were Imperial forces operating in this sector, we had a duty to make contact and report what we had learned about the threat that had consumed this world. "Set course for the signal source," I decided, "but keep us buttoned up and weapons ready. If this is a trap, we'll make them pay for it." The tank's machine spirit hummed with what might have been approval or might have been anxiety as Vak adjusted our heading toward the northwest. The terrain we crossed showed increasing signs of the transformation process. Vegetation that grew in perfectly geometric patterns, rock formations that curved with organic precision, streams that flowed in channels too regular to be natural. But there were also signs of resistance. Craters marked where Imperial artillery had attempted to halt the spreading corruption. Defensive positions had been carved into hillsides and reinforced with standard-issue materials. Vehicle tracks crisscrossed the landscape in patterns that suggested organized military movement rather than the chaotic wandering of corrupted beings. "Signal strength is increasing," Vak reported. "We should have visual contact within the next few minutes." I pressed my eye to the primary site, scanning the horizon for any sign of Imperial positions. What I saw was both reassuring and troubling. A defensive perimeter that followed standard tactical doctrine, but one that showed signs of hasty construction and desperate improvisation. Razor wire had been strung between twisted metal posts that looked suspiciously like repurposed alien artifacts. Firing positions had been carved from materials that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. The defenders were using the corruption against itself, turning the alien technology to Imperial purposes. It was a pragmatic solution to a desperate situation, but it suggested that they had been cut off from proper supply lines and reinforcement for an extended period. Iron Fist 7, this is Firebase Redemption. crackled a voice over the vox, speaking Imperial Gothic with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Identify yourself and state your intentions. Firebase Redemption. This is Gunner Sergeant Voss, 3rd Armored Company, Cadian 47th Shock Troops. We are survivors of the initial deployment to this sector. Request permission to approach for debriefing and resupply." The pause that followed my transmission lasted long enough to make me nervous. When the voice returned, it carried a note of suspicion that confirmed my fears about how our presence would be received. "Sergeant Voss, our records show 3rd Armored Company was declared lost with all hands 3 weeks ago. You are ordered to halt at a distance of 500 meters and prepare for inspection. Any attempt to approach closer without authorization will be met with hostile fire." "Understood." Firebase Redemption. Halting at 500 meters, I signaled VAC to bring us to a stop at the designated distance, then opened the commander's hatch for the first time since we had entered the corrupted structure. The air outside the tank was cooler than I remembered, carrying scents of normal vegetation mixed with the metallic tang of alien corruption, but it was still recognizably planetary atmosphere, not the recycled air that had sustained us during our imprisonment. A small group emerged from the firebase perimeter, moving with the practiced caution of soldiers who had learned to distrust everything on this world. They wore standard guard uniforms, but their equipment showed the same signs of improvisation I had noticed in the perimeter defenses. Weapons had been modified with components that definitely weren't Imperial standard. Personal armor showed patches and repairs that involved materials I couldn't identify. The leader of the group was a major whose insignia identified him as belonging to the Mordian Iron Guard, though his uniform had been so extensively modified that little of the original remained. Half his face was covered by what looked like a breathing apparatus, and one arm had been replaced by a mechanical prosthetic that moved with inhuman precision. "Sergeant Voss," he said as he approached our position, his voice distorted by the breathing apparatus into something that sounded more mechanical than human. "I am Major Corvin, acting commander of Firebase Redemption. You and your crew will exit the vehicle and submit to medical examination before any further discussion can take place." I had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Once they saw the extent of our modifications, there would be no hiding what had happened to us. The best we could hope for was that they would listen to our report before deciding whether we represented a threat to Imperial security. "Understood, Major. We'll comply with your inspection procedures. But I should warn you that we've all been exposed to the corruption that's affecting this world. We may not appear entirely normal to your medical personnel." "I assumed as much," Corvin replied, his tone suggesting that unusual appearances were nothing new to the survivors of Firebase Redemption. "The corruption affects everyone who spends extended time on this world. The question is whether you've retained enough of your humanity to serve the Emperor's purposes." That was a more encouraging response than I had dared hope for. If the Firebase had been dealing with corrupted personnel for weeks, they might have developed procedures for determining friend from foe that went beyond simple visual inspection. One by one, we climbed out of the tank and submitted to examination by the Major's team. Their medical scanner was a hybrid device that combined Imperial technology with components I didn't recognize, probably salvaged from the alien installations and repurposed for human use. It hummed and clicked as it passed over our bodies, recording data that would determine our fate. The technician operating the scanner was herself extensively modified, with mechanical implants that covered half her skull and hands that had been replaced by precision instruments. But there was still something recognizably human in her eyes, still individual consciousness directing the use of alien technology rather than being directed by it. "Extensive integration with mechanical systems," she reported to Major Corvin. "But neural patterns remain within human parameters. Consciousness appears to be individual rather than collective. Recommendation: cautious acceptance, pending extended observation." "Very well," the Major said. "Sergeant Voss, you and your crew are granted temporary sanctuary within Firebase Redemption, but you will be confined to designated areas and monitored at all times until we can determine the full extent of your modifications and their implications for security." It wasn't the warm welcome I might have hoped for, but it was better than summary execution. And it gave us an opportunity to share what we had learned about the true nature of the threat that had consumed this world. Firebase Redemption proved to be a remarkable achievement in applied battlefield engineering. The defenders had carved their position into a hillside that provided natural protection while offering excellent fields of fire across the surrounding terrain. But what made it truly impressive was the way they had incorporated alien technology into their defensive systems without being consumed by it. Weapon emplacements used hybrid targeting systems that combined Imperial fire control with alien sensors of impossible precision. Communication arrays had been enhanced with components that allowed them to penetrate the electromagnetic interference that plagued normal Vox systems. Even basic utilities like water purification and waste recycling had been improved through careful integration of alien technology. "How do you maintain control?" I asked Major Corvin as he showed us around the firebase. "How do you use this technology without being corrupted by it?" "Through constant vigilance and iron discipline," he replied. "Every piece of alien equipment is blessed by our chaplain before installation. Every person who works with it undergoes daily examination for signs of corruption, and anyone who shows signs of losing their individual consciousness is immediately isolated until they recover or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The survivors of Firebase Redemption had learned to walk the razor's edge between using alien technology and being consumed by it. It was a precarious balance that required constant attention and absolute commitment to maintaining their essential humanity. But it also offered hope. If they had found ways to resist the corruption while still benefiting from the advanced technology, perhaps there was a path forward that didn't require choosing between human consciousness and mechanical precision. Perhaps the tension between flesh and metal could be maintained rather than resolved, creating something new without destroying what was essentially human. As night fell over the transformed landscape, I found myself standing on the firebase's observation deck, looking out over terrain that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. In the distance, the ruins of the corrupted structure where we had made our choice between individual consciousness and collective transcendence glowed with residual energy from the failed integration process. We had survived, but survival was only the beginning. Now we had to find a way to carry our knowledge back to the Imperium, to warn them of threats that went beyond simple heretical rebellion or Xenos incursion. We had to help them understand that the boundary between flesh and metal was becoming a battlefield where the fate of human consciousness itself would be decided. The tank that had carried us through this nightmare sat in the firebase's motor pool, her hull still bearing the scars of our journey, but her machine spirit at peace with the hybrid consciousness we had become. She was proof that the integration of human and mechanical consciousness could preserve what was essentially human while enhancing capabilities beyond normal limits. Whatever came next, we would face it together. 4 transformed soldiers and their mechanical partner, bound by shared experience and mutual loyalty, carrying knowledge that might help humanity navigate the challenges of a galaxy where the line between flesh and metal was becoming increasingly blurred. We were still human, in the ways that mattered most, and perhaps that was enough to tip the balance toward a future where consciousness and technology could coexist without one consuming the other.